World of Warfare presents the Battle of the Dnieper River. By late summer of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front was now turning increasingly against Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht forces after their sweeping 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union had left the Russians in a position of desperate near defeat. Germany's July defeat at Kursk had shattered any lingering notion of the Nazis' invincibility, making the last major strategic offensive the Wehrmacht would ever launch in the East, while the massive armored clashes at Prokhorovka and the failure of Operation Citadel left German troops exhausted, badly undermanned, and increasingly on the defensive. For the Soviets, Kursk marked not just an important victory, but a growing tidal wave of superiority over the Germans, both in manpower, armor, artillery, and operational confidence. Soviet commanders no longer fought reactive and desperate campaigns, but now planned and executed continuous and deadly offensives along the entirety of an 1,800-mile front, leaving Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin and his Soviet High Command, or Stavka, with a rising understanding that now was the time for a decisive blow. Accordingly, Stalin called for the liberation of the Ukraine and the destruction of Germany's Army Group South by seizing the Germans' natural defensive barrier along the western banks of the Dnieper River. Stretching more than 1,400 miles from Belarus to the Black Sea, the Dnieper was one of the largest rivers in Europe, wide, swift, and bordered in many places by steep western banks. It also served as Hitler's backbone for his new defensive line intended to stabilize his growing failures along the Eastern Front, a place he referred to as his Ostwall, or Eastern Wall. In many places, the river was more than a half a mile wide, with marshy floodplains, islands, and wickedly fast currents. Yet as the Soviets engaged the bloody Battle of the Dnieper, Hitler's Ostwall theory would prove to be disastrously wrong. For the Germans, the Dnieper provided a natural anti-tank barrier with clear defensive lines that stood the chance to shorten or tighten their massive front lines, offering them crucial time to rebuild and reinforce their shattered divisions. For the Russians, an assault on the river would require improvised river crossings that were bound to cost many Soviet lives in the face of stiff German resistance. Yet to successfully cross it meant the liberation of Kyiv and the Ukraine, which was rich in coal, grain, heavy industry, and transportation networks vital to their war effort, not to mention a place that was indispensable to the Soviet Union's full recovery as a nation. By August of 1943, the Red Army deployed 4 massive fronts against Army Group South, including the Central Front under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Voronezh Front led by Nikolai Vatutin, Ivan Konev's Steppe Front, and Rodion Malinoisky's Southwestern Front. Numbering over 2.6 million men, the 4 fronts were supported by more than 50,000 artillery pieces, 2,400 tanks, and 2,800 aircraft, a testament to Russia's ability to muster large quantities of fighting men, as well as the industrial might required to support them. Opposing the Soviets was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably the Wehrmacht's most capable operational commander. Yet even Manstein could not compensate for his understrength divisions, non-existent reserves, a badly reduced Luftwaffe, and Hitler's constant interference that crippled his flexibility. Followed immediately after their victory at Kursk, from August to December of 1943, Soviet forces attacked German positions across eastern Ukraine, liberating Kharkov for the 4th and final time, before recapturing Belgorod, Poltava, and Sumy in a string of overlapping operations. Russia's now overwhelming military superiority forced German troops into a fighting retreat from each fallen city, as they attempted to delay Soviet spearheads long enough to reach the Dnieper River. Entire German divisions fell back in chaotic disarray, abandoning tanks and heavy equipment due to fuel shortages and intense Soviet air attacks. Manstein pleaded with his German high command, seeking permission for elastic withdrawals and counteroffensives, yet Hitler refused each of his pleas, insisting captured cities must be held as fortresses, even if they lacked strategic value, a rigidity that would prove fatal for scores of German soldiers until Hitler's death by suicide in advance of the fall of Berlin to the Soviets. Under Hitler's delusion that the Dnieper was equivalent to the Siegfried Line, he ordered the hasty construction of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles along the western banks of the river, while nearby villages were to be turned into strong points. The reality was a grim one, however, made worse by insufficient manpower and a scarcity of materials, leaving German troops partially exposed in shallow trenches scraped into drought-hardened riverbanks. Entire German units arrived at the Dnieper under conditions of total disorder, devoid of both heavy weapons and sufficient time to build defenses. Now seen as one of the greatest pursuits in military history, from late August to September, Soviet tank armies, mechanized cavalry groups, and infantry formations pushed westward day and night, with an objective to reach the Dnieper before the Germans could consolidate. As the dead and wounded mounted on both sides, the Soviets attacked relentlessly, often without rest or resupply, while German rear guards launched counterattacks and destroyed bridges, forcing the Soviets to cross the river in fishing boats, rafts made of doors and barrels, or simply swimming in the frigid waters of the river under heavy German fire. By September, Red Army forces had reached the river along a several hundred-mile front, leading to the Great Crossings of September and October, which embodied one of the most chaotic and brutal amphibious operations in military history. Soviet commanders ordered immediate crossings wherever possible, regardless of the cost in men and machines. Entire infantry units crossed the river en masse, often without artillery support, resulting in the loss of entire units to the last man. Other crossings succeeded only because German units were too weak or disorganized to repel them. Yet despite the ongoing slaughter of Russian men, by October of 1943, the Red Army had established more than 20 bridgeheads over the river, allowing Soviet forces to dig in on the western side despite staggering casualties. In the months and years following the Battle of the Dnieper River, the slaughter of Russian men would become synonymous with sacrifice in Russian history, awarding some 2,438 Hero of the Soviet Union medals for actions during the crossings, more than any other single operation during the war. Stories soon emerged about platoons holding bridgeheads against withering German tank assaults, engineers repairing crossings under heavy artillery fire, medics ferrying the wounded across the river in small boats, and commanders personally leading charges when units began to falter. Soviet casualties during the campaign have been estimated at over 1.2 million men, including over 400,000 killed in action. The Germans also suffered egregious losses during the Great Crossings, including over 100,000 killed in action, further shrinking Germany's now desperately low manpower reserve. At first believing that Kyiv was secure, the Germans focused their defenses south of the city, leading Vatutin to exploit the assumption by shifting armor and men north of the city under the cover of darkness and complete radio silence. On November 3rd, consequently, Vatutin launched a surprise offensive from the Lyute bridgehead, roughly 19 miles north of Kyiv. Within days, German defenses had completely collapsed, leading to the liberation of Kyiv on November the 6th, which ended Germany's occupation of the city since September of 1941. Manstein attempted counterattacks in November, briefly retaking Zhytomyr before threatening Kyiv. Yet in the face of the Soviets' seemingly endless reserves of men, compared to Germany's lack of them, Soviet offensives across the entire Dnieper line collapsed the remnants of German resistance along the western banks of the river, forcing the last surviving soldiers of Army Group South into a long retreat toward the Carpathian Mountains. In one of the largest military operations in recorded human history, marked not by a single dramatic battle, but by grinding, relentless assaults on German strategic positions, the Battle of the Dnieper River handed the Soviet Red Army a permanent offensive initiative for the remainder of the war, while irreparably damaging German manpower and morale, not to mention the loss of its last natural defensive line on the Eastern Front. The battle also demonstrated the Soviets' new mastery of large-scale operational warfare, founded on industrial output of war material and demographic power, at the same time highlighting Germany's failure of static defenses without mobile reserves available for reinforcements of fallen troops. If Stalingrad broke the German Sixth Army and Kursk broke German offensive power, then the Battle of the Dnieper River broke Germany's ability to defend the Eastern Front with any meaningful degree of resistance, making the Battle of the Dnieper River yet another turning point moment in Germany's slow descent from power.